Welcome back. In our last lecture, we took our 6 ethical theories and applied them to the question of euthanasia. We saw that each theory answered that question in its own way, and that underneath all 6 answers, there was a single buried question: whether pain is grounds for ending a life. Today, we are going to do the same thing again, but with a very different kind of killing. Today, we are going to ask about war. So here is our question: when, if ever, is going to war okay? Notice how large a question this actually is. War does not mean one person dying. War means killing on a massive scale. Entire populations mobilized against one another. Soldiers ordered to kill people they have never met and have no personal grievance against. Now, many already believe that killing another human being is deeply wrong. So the question we have to answer is this: what, if anything, could make this particular kind of killing different from murder? Before we scale this question up to the size of nations, let's start small, with something closer to home. Most of us already believe that a person is justified in killing someone who is attacking them, provided a few things are true. First, the threat has to be real and immediate. There has to be no other way out. Furthermore, the force used has to be proportionate. You do not, for example, shoot a man for, say, shoving you. When those conditions are met, we do not call it murder. We call it self-defense. Now, here's the question underneath our topic for today. Does that same logic scale up? If it is sometimes okay for one person to kill another in self-defense, is it sometimes okay for one nation to kill another nation's soldiers in what amounts to national self-defense? And if so, what has to be true for that to count as justified, the way certain things had to be true for the person defending himself? That is what we are going to work out. Now, before we do, we have to answer the question of, so what? Why does this question matter so much? Who cares? Well, for one, it has mattered to every generation that has ever lived, because every generation has faced war in some form. But there is a deeper reason too. If we cannot say what makes some killing in war different from murder, then we have no way to condemn the wars that seemed wrong, and no way to defend the ones that seem necessary. We need some standard, or else every war becomes indistinguishable from every other. So let us bring our 6 theories to this question, the same way we did with euthanasia. We have to ask each one, when, if ever, is war okay? Again, just as a side note, I have to say from the outset that these are possible answers that each theory might give. They are not exhaustive, and they are not the final word. And so with that, we will start with moral relativism. The relativist says that it depends. There is no objective answer here. No standard above what a particular person or a particular culture happens to believe. If your nation believes a war is justified, then for your nation it is. If another nation disagrees, then for that nation it is not. There is no further fact anyone can appeal to. War, like much else for the relativist, becomes a matter of preference for yours and your country's. Next, there is the ethical egoist. Remember, the egoist tells us to act for our personal interest, our own personal interest, for our own good. So under what conditions would the egoist say a war is worth fighting? Only insofar as it benefits the egoist personally. Now notice, a country's interest can matter to the egoist, but only because that interest comes back around and impacts him directly. If his country loses a war, for example, his taxes rise to pay for it. His safety is put at risk. His standing in the world falls. So the egoist supports the war his country wages only when winning it serves his own life, his own money, his own security, and his own interest. The country is never really the object of his concern wholesale. Rather, his own interest is. Now the utilitarian. The utilitarian weighs benefit against harm. pleasure against pain for everyone the action touches, including the enemy. So the utilitarian asks, if we go to war, and if we think we will win it, will the outcome maximize pleasure and minimize pain across everyone involved? If the total good produced by the war outweighs the total harm it causes, then the war is justified. If it brings more harm than good, then it is not justified. So for the utilitarian, the entire question comes down to that balance. Now to the virtue ethicist. The virtue ethicist says it depends on the situation, but draws one line firmly. You cannot kill innocent human beings. War is not something to be sought out, the way a person of good character does not go looking for a fight. It is entered more so out of self-defense, and even then, it has to be waged in a way that is proportionate to and befitting of what war actually calls for. War requires acting upon other people in ways that are, by their nature, rarely proportionate or restrained. So the virtue ethicist asks what a person of real practical wisdom would permit here, and what they would never permit. The natural law theorist, on the other hand, takes a similar view, but reasons to it in the theory's own way. He will tell us that war is permitted, if at all, only as a last resort, in such a way that you are trying to preserve as many lives as possible, and you go to war only if that is genuinely what is required to preserve them, the people. You do not lead out looking to fight. This is because life is a basic good that we are ordered toward protecting, and war can only ever be justified as a means of protecting it, never as something worth pursuing for its own sake. Finally, the deontological ethicist has a certain view as well. So we could take the categorical imperative, the test of whether we could will everyone to act on our principle. Ask first about the aggressor. Could we universalize the following? Attack another people or group of people whenever it benefits you. Well, if we universalize that, we would find that we'd run into some absurdities. We'd run into a world where everyone acting on that principle would be a world where every person is treated as a mere obstacle in someone else's way, a mere means to someone else's ends. And no one could rationally will a world like that for themselves. But now ask about the defender. Could we universalize this? Resist those who try to use you and your people as a mere tool for their own purposes. That principle does not destroy itself the way the aggressor's does. So defensive war can be justified for the deontologist, not because it preserves the good of life, the way natural law would say, but because aggression treats people as mere means, and no one may be treated that way. And notice this carries forward into how the war is fought as well. Even the enemy is never a mere means. That single point already tells us something about the limits on how a war may be waged, not only about whether it may be started. Now, the question that we have been raising, the question of when is war justified and when it is not, has a long history and a name. It is called just war theory. Over centuries of careful thought, 5 conditions, depending on how you count them, have emerged that are generally held to be necessary together for a war to count as just. All 5 conditions must be met, so that even if a single one is missing, then by the standard of just war theory, this is not a just war. The first condition is right intent. The war must be waged for the protection of one's own people or the innocent, rather than for motives like vengeance, malice, or greed. The second condition is right authority. War must be declared and carried out by a legitimate, recognized government, not by a private group or an individual acting on their own. The third condition is just cause. There must be a clear provocation, an unjust attack already suffered, or an immediate and real threat. Preemptive strikes for the sake of economic gain or land acquisition do not count. The fourth condition is last resort. Every avenue for peaceful negotiation must be genuinely exhausted before anyone turns to violence. And the fifth condition is probability of success. There has to be a reasonable hope that the military action will actually achieve peace, rather than senseless destruction in a fight with no chance of being won. Now, I want to pause and note something else here, since it is worth knowing even if we will not dwell on it today. There is also a second, separate set of questions in this tradition, not about whether it is right to go to war in the first place, but about how a war is fought once it has already begun. Do you spare the people who are not fighting, for example? Do you use only as much force as the situation actually calls for? These are serious questions in their own right, and they matter enormously, but they are still a different matter from the 5 conditions that we just laid out. Our 5 conditions ask whether a war should be started at all. The second set asks whether, once started, it is being fought rightly. We will keep our focus on the first 5 today, but I wanted you to know the second set exists as well, because it is worth keeping in mind once a war is actually underway. From all this, we find ourselves approaching an even deeper question, and it is the same kind of question we have been asking all semester long. It is not enough to ask about what each theory says regarding war. We have to ask whether that theory actually has the resources to justify these 5 conditions as truly binding, as things a nation really must do, or whether it can only make the conditions look convenient to praise when it is winning and convenient to abandon when it is not. So let's take the relativist first. The relativist seemingly cannot ground any of the 5 conditions as binding on anyone. Remember, since the relativist reduces ethics to descriptive ethics, the relativist can describe what a particular culture happens to call just, but cannot say that any nation truly must comply with last resort, or truly must have the right intent. There is no standard above the nation's own preference to appeal to. So just war theory, as a set of binding conditions, is not something relativism can support. It can only report on what various people already believe. Now the egoist. The egoist can certainly follow the 5 conditions, but only when doing so serves his own reputation and his own self-interest. He may well keep up with the appearance of right intent and just cause, because honor and the good opinion others hold of him is worth something to him too. But notice, the moment secrecy, or simply overwhelming power, removes the cost of breaking one of these conditions, the egoist has no reason left to keep it. This is the very same problem we found with the shopkeeper who gave correct change only because cheating would eventually cost him his business. Take away the cost, and the compliance disappears with it. The utilitarian, on the other hand, can ground some of these conditions fairly easily, since a few of them are already just questions of weighing cost against benefit. Last resort and probability of success fit naturally here, since both ask us to calculate whether the outcome is worth it. But the utilitarian seems to struggle with just cause and right intent as absolute conditions, the kind that cannot be crossed no matter what. Because if breaking one of them produced a better overall outcome, say, striking first produced less total suffering than waiting to be struck, then on strict utilitarian grounds, there is no principled reason left standing to forbid it. So for the utilitarian then, these 5 conditions are really guidelines that can be broken when necessary, rather than 5 strict conditions. Now to the virtue ethicist. The virtue ethicist can ground restraint and proportion through the practical wisdom of a person of good character, someone who reads the particular situation rather than following a rule blindly. But we already know the difficulty that follows the virtue ethicist everywhere. This restraint still leans on a picture of human flourishing and human nature that virtue ethics itself, taken by itself, was never quite able to secure on its own. Hence, virtue ethics needs to look for a meta-ethical view to give it its grounding. Natural law, on the other hand, grounds just cause and last resort quite firmly, since for natural law, war can only ever be for the sake of preserving the basic good of life, never something sought for its own sake. And natural law can also ground the refusal to target the innocent, through the very same move we used at the door in our natural law lecture, and again in our lecture on euthanasia. What matters is what you actually aim at. To aim directly at harming the innocent is always wrong, even if some harm to others is foreseen as a side effect of an otherwise legitimate act. That distinction between what you intend and what you merely foresee does real work here. And the deontologist grounds right intent and the refusal to treat any person, even the enemy, as a mere means, cleanly and without exception. But the deontologist may struggle to give a fully satisfying answer for last resort and probability of success, since both of those are judgment calls about a particular situation, about the moral law, as we learned. Or let me backtrack. The moral law, as we learned, was never built to bend to circumstances. This is the very same tension we found when we asked why prudence seemed to have no home in deontological ethics at all. This leaves an open question, not necessarily an objection, but an open question. Is it possible to create a universal rule that takes into account all of the changing circumstances? Now, before we close, I want to bring in one more consideration, one that a number of people today are raising, and one I think that deserves a real hearing. We have been treating self-defense as one of the most secure justifications for going to war, the case that is hardest to argue against. But some argue today that our very concept of war has changed since the arrival of the nuclear age and the rise of artificial intelligence in warfare, and that this change is significant enough that we have to re-evaluate what conditions, like last resort and probability of success, can even mean anymore. A nuclear exchange, for example, does not stay contained the way older wars did. And a war fought with the help of artificial intelligence can escalate faster than any human being can deliberate. So the very conditions that one made, self-defense, a clear and contained response, may no longer hold in quite the same way. Under this view, we should be far more willing to enter into dialogue before we consider war, wherever that is genuinely possible, precisely because the cost of war does not seem worth it anymore. There is a further point worth sitting with as well. The arms industry generates billions of dollars in profit each year. If even a portion of what is spent preparing for and waging war were instead directed toward pressing humanitarian needs, hunger being one of the most obvious, we would have to ask what more could be done with it. I'm not saying that it is wrong to go to war per se, but I am saying that regardless of our position, we have to be self-conscious, conscious of how others are affected and whether there are better means to secure our goal. So, where does this leave us? Something has happened here that should look familiar by now. All 6 ethical theories can say something about when war might be permitted, but it's not clear whether all of them can actually stop a nation from crossing a line once crossing it becomes convenient. And notice one more thing before we close. The very question we have been asking all semester keeps returning to us, no matter where we point our theories. Is there a real foundation for morality? Something more than preference, more than self-interest, more than whichever outcome we happen to prefer in the moment. We found it hiding underneath the question of a suffering patient asking to die. We have now found it hiding underneath the question of a nation deciding whether to go to war. That same foundation is what should now push us to ask whether dialogue, difficult and slow as it is, deserves far more of our effort than it currently gets, before we ever reach for war at all. After all, if we are going to disagree with the role of dialogue in any rational way, do we not have to engage in dialogue? I hope this was helpful. Thank you.